So in 2008, the word biocitizenship became a key word identified by the medical journal Lancet, probably the most well known medical journal in the world. And that was a kind of recognition that biocitizenship was becoming a widely used and recognized term. So, in the definition that Roger Kuta writes for the Lancet, and which is shared in the readings, Kuta differentiates Petrina's definition from a later definition by Novas and Rose. So he writes, for Petrina, biocitizenship described the individual and collective welfare claims made by a biologically damaged population, as well as the political exploitation of those injuries in Ukrainian nationalism. As such, this use of biocitizenship involved the application of familiar Western notions of the mutual rights and duties of citizens and states. Wholly at odds with this use, however, is another that appeared only a few years later. For Nicholas Rose and Carlos Novas in their essay on biological citizenship, this term described new connections being made between biology and self-identity. They argued that contemporary biotechnology makes new ideas of what it means to be a human being. So I don't entirely agree with that distinction, because as we saw with Petrina, she is sensitive to the notion of the forms of new identity around biosocialities. In addition, Rose and Novas also reference Petrina's work as encompassing in their definition. Nonetheless, it is a useful distinction to think about the different forms in which biological citizenship can be used, because for Petrina, she is still very much talking about a kind of a classic sense of citizenship, as in a claim on the state. I mean, she is attentive to humanitarian funding and these sorts of things, but her definition of biological citizenship is still very much embedded in the idea of a connection with the state. Novus and Rose, for instance, moved the idea of citizenship to a much broader idea of citizenship, which is a set of using identity around an illness, a particular biological condition, a genetic condition, and so on, to mobilize for a set of claims. But they also make it a lot more explicit that these claims are made within the context of the market, the formation of, also non-state actors like charities, donors, funders, and so on. And I think this is really important when thinking about what citizenship means in the context of migration, because the term, there's a lot of slippage in the term. In some senses, citizenship can refer to a specific claim on the state, for instance, having a passport, or even an asylum document, or something which is about the state as an actor. In another sense, in citizenship studies, there's a much broader sense in which citizenship is a form of claim and entitlement, which also links to, for instance, humanitarian actors and other forms of actors. And we'll see this with therapeutic citizenship. So it's important to be careful about the usage of the term citizenship and biocitizenship and what exactly you mean, because not everyone is speaking about the same thing. So I'm not going to go into all the examples that Rose and Novas give, but they then make the distinction of biological citizenship as a distinct form of citizenship from a kind of classic citizenship. For instance, they write about citizenship projects in the old sense. So they write, by citizen projects, we mean the ways in which authorities about some individuals as potential citizens and the ways in which they tried to act upon them. the ways in which authorities thought about some individuals as potential citizens and the ways in which they tried to act upon them. Examples include defining those who are entitled to participate in the political affairs of a city or region, imposing a single system across national territory, obliging citizens to speak a single national language, and so on. I'm not going to read the full quote. But their key point is that citizenship was very much embedded in this project of nationalism in the nation state. But with their idea of biocitizenship moves beyond that. So it's not only thinking about the nation state. So they write, biological citizenship is both individualizing and collectivizing. It is individualized to the extent that individuals shape their relations with themselves in terms of knowledge of their somatic individuality. Biological images, explanations, values, and judgments thus get entangled with the more general contemporary regime of the self as a prudent yet enterprising individual, actively shaping his or her life course through acts of choice. So I'm not, the reading will be shared if you want to read through the examples, but in essence what they're speaking to is about a sense of self-fashioning, a sense of the way in which identities form around individual and collective identities form around a particular medical diagnosis and become a way in which individuals forge economic, political, individual relationships. And that can be through the market. They also reference, for instance, people using knowledge on the internet. But the key idea here is that the biocitizenship in their context is moving beyond a narrow conception of state citizenship. Another key intervention in this, in the same volume, the Global Assemblages by V.K. Nguyen, is the concept of therapeutic citizenship. And this is important because the idea of therapeutic citizenship has been very influential in the literature on HIV/AIDS in Africa. And it's a deliberate broadening out of the term biological citizenship to encompass the relationships with humanitarian actors. So Nguyen's study was based on anthropological research in Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire, in the early 2000s, in a period before there was the widespread rollout of antiretroviral therapy. And in order to access antiretroviral therapy, particular social networks were needed, particularly with humanitarian agencies. And so his notion of therapeutic citizenship is specifically not about the state, because in those early stages, it wasn't the state providing treatment. It was primarily humanitarian actors. And so he writes, therapeutic citizenship broadens biological notions of citizenship, whereby a biological construct, such as being HIV positive, is used to ascribe an essentialized identity, as in all earlier forms of eugenics and racial ordering. Therapeutic citizenship is a biopolitical citizenship, a system of claims and ethical projects that arise out of the conjugation of techniques used to govern populations and manage individual bodies. The notion of therapeutic citizenship points to a growing transnational influence of biomedical knowledge and practice in the government of human and non-human affairs. So he writes on biopower, while the globalization of HIV/AIDS prevention set the stage for the emergence of a globalized politics of access to treatment, it shows how a biosocial formation, self-help organized according to biomedical diagnosis, can articulate with biopolitical processes. The biopolitical production of subjects is ever more tied to the biomedical. So that may sound very complex, but what in essence he's talking about is that the way in which new forms of biosocial groupings, HIV support groups, for instance, become central both to the formation of new identities, but also the formation of new relationships to the state, but particularly new relationships to humanitarian actors, where the biomedical diagnosis of, say, being HIV positive is mobilized to make particular claims, form particular relationships. And these are transnational because many of the funding is coming through transnational organizations. And I think this broadening of the idea of biological citizenship to encompass humanitarian actors is really important in the study of migration and refugee flows, where often the claims made by cross-border migrants or refugees are not necessarily on the state. They can be, for instance, the attempt to access public health care, but they can also be on other transnational actors. For instance, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, for many years, from I think around 2007, was providing healthcare to migrants in Johannesburg because they were being excluded from access to the state. So eventually, with mobilization, the cross-border migrants and undocumented migrants gained increasing access to state primary health care, although of course there's still issues with medical xenophobia. But the issue there is in the absence of the state provision of basic primary health care or other forms of health care, humanitarian actors often fulfill those roles. Well, does this this doesn't necessarily, again, all of this analysis is to say that's not a bad thing necessarily. Of course, it's good for people to have access to healthcare, but it does produce certain power dynamics because it means that the lives of certain groups and populations are dependent on non-state actors, on humanitarian actors, on and often there are forms of criteria in order to access resources, and there's a literature on this I can't go into, but the dynamics, of who has access to resources, on what criteria, who has access to asylum, for instance, is the body used to access certain claims to asylum through illness or through violence or torture. These are things that you'll think throughout this whole module, and I'm not going to go into here. But the key point here is that the expansion of the notion of biological citizenship to therapeutic citizenship or other concepts is thinking of citizenship not just related to biology and the state. It's the state, humanitarian actors, market actors, and so on. And Nguyen also gives his own reading of biosociality, the social and behavioral change implicated here engenders new social groupings bound by the hopes, fears, fates, and politics that have been made available to sufferers on the basis of biological knowledge. So new relationship forms between biology and identity, And so these, again, one can't just separate the state from forms of sociality, from forms of identity. And this has been one of the critiques of the term is, that, kinship relationships remain important, supportive, forms of other support. For instance, in a book called Second Chances, Surviving AIDS in Uganda, edited by Susan Reynolds White, one of the critiques of the book is that therapeutic citizenship neglects, the forms of kinship, clientship, social networks. And so just because we focus our analysis in how diseases mobilize to make certain claims doesn't mean that we can just ignore other types of relationships that are implied. But I think the idea of biocitizenship is to try theorize these links. Another use of the term, and I'm not going to go too into depth with it, is how the emergent health citizenships, and the anthropologist Stephen Robbins writes about the treatment action campaign and how HIV/AIDS became very important form of mobilization in the post-apartheid era for rights to the state. And, there's a huge constitutional court case forcing the state to provide mother-to-child ARVs to prevent mother-to-child transmission and so on. And Robbins explicitly draws on the notion of biocitizenship and writes that illness narratives and treatment testimonies that are analyzed in this article suggest that the experience of illness, treatment, and participation in treatment action campaign and Doctors Without Borders can produce radical transformations in subjectivity and identity that go well beyond conventional liberal democratic conceptions of right and citizenship. HIV/AIDS in South Africa has also contributed towards new forms of health citizenship that are concerned with both rights-based struggles and creating collectively shared meanings of the extreme experiences of illness and stigmatization of individual AIDS sufferers. So, this again is a more classic conception of biological citizenship closer to Petrina. It's about the claims made by the state on the basis of a particular condition. But we also have to hold this in question, because who is excluded here? In my own research in inner city Johannesburg, for instance, many undocumented migrants are accessing antiretroviral treatment, but they don't have those networks of support. They aren't part of these support groups, these self-help groups, these activist groups. So they might go to the clinic and then come back. And so one has to think about these dynamics, Are, cross-border migrants who are HIV positive being excluded from these new forms of health citizenship on the basis that they don't have a passport or aren't South African and so on? Well, these are questions that we need more research to explore, and I'm sure Joe and others will speak to them. But the key point is, I don't think we should just abandon the concept of biocitizenship as being specifically as connected to, the citizenship as in having a passport ID, as in a claim to the state. We just need to be very careful about how the term is used, because sometimes the same term is used meaning different things. And so as writers, as researchers, we need to be quite clear on, well, what do we mean? Are we talking about biocitizenship as a relation to the state, as a relationship to humanitarian actors, as new forms of identity, as all of these things, and that's, we just need to be analytically precise, because there's no single definition of the term. So I haven't moved on to the issue of migration here, which we'll explore in the other modules of the course. But what I've hoped to do here is just to give you some of the background of the development of the term biocitizenship, the conceptual uses of the term, and also that thinking about these things needs to be thought of in a colonial and post-colonial context. And finally, that there's varying definitions of the term, and that you really need to understand how you use a term if you're using it in your own writing, but you can also adapt a term and show its limitations. Conceptual development requires also pointing out the limitations of certain concepts. So I'll be meeting you for your discussions, but I just pose a few questions to think about that we can discuss in relationship to your own experiences, and more specifically in relationship to migration. So these are as follows. To what extent does national citizenship shape health access in Africa? So again, I want us to think about both in which healthcare is embedded in the sort of citizenship project of the nation state. But then, are there other forms of citizenship, as in sets of rights and claims based on biology, that are emerging in Africa? As we've discussed, there are forms of therapeutic citizenship around HIV/AIDS, but that's just one example. Can you think of other examples? In what ways might issues of race, gender, ability, disability, and nationality shape biocitizenship? Sorry, that should be nationality. So in that sense, how are new forms of claims distinguished? How are they divided? What new forms of inequality emerge? What new forms of biopolitics? And can the concept of biocitizenship be used in relationship to migration and health in Africa? Well, I'm not going to give that answer. That's something you have to think about. And you might decide, no, well, this concept is too limited. It doesn't have anything to say about this topic. Or you might decide, well, there's actually a lot which the concept or the various conceptualizations can be used. So that's really up to you to think through, and we can have that discussion when we meet. So many thanks for your time and for following this lecture through, and I look forward to the discussion. Take care.